Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're digging into something that really affects all of us, how markets react when things change.
And importantly, the role governments sometimes play in, well, steering those changes.
Exactly. We've got some really interesting material you've sent over, and our mission today is to pull out the key ideas about market elasticity and government intervention.
Right. Helping you see the economics behind everyday things.
Yeah, like, have you ever noticed how, say, a sudden cold snap makes orange juice prices jump? Or how a new government policy suddenly, ripples through the economy in unexpected ways?
Those are perfect examples.
Okay, let's get into it. What makes these markets tick?
Well, a fundamental concept that jumps out from the sources is elasticity.
Elasticity.
Yeah, it's basically about responsiveness. How much do buyers and sellers change what they're doing when things, especially prices, shift around?
Okay, responsiveness. So the most common one is probably price elasticity of demand.
That's the one. It focuses on you, the buyer. How much does your demand for something change when the price goes up or down?
Right. And the material highlighted something called elastic demand. That's where even a small price tweak can cause a pretty big change in how much people want to buy it.
Precisely. Think about different brands of something simple, like tea bags. If your usual brand suddenly costs more...
You'd probably just switch, right?
Exactly. Because there are so many similar options, that's elastic demand in action. What did the sources say about why that happens?
It seems like it boils down to having choices, really. Lots of substitutes mean you're not locked in. The sources also mentioned things like non-essential stuff where you have alternatives, like choosing a fancy restaurant.
Oh yeah, good one.
If one place hikes its prices, you might just, pick a different nice restaurant or even decide to eat in. Alternatives make you more price sensitive.
Makes sense.
And then there are bigger buys, like TVs. A price jump there definitely makes you think twice, maybe wait for a sale because it's a bigger chunk of your budget.
Absolutely right. And the material lays out those factors clearly. Availability of substitutes, is it a luxury or non-essential, how much of your budget it takes up, how narrowly defined the market is, like that specific tea brand again.
Right.
And crucially, having time to think and compare.
Okay, so that's elastic. What about the other side of the coin? Inelastic demand.
Inelastic is where price changes. Well, they don't really move the needle much on how much people buy. Even a big price hike might lead to only a small drop in demand, or sometimes almost none.
So you basically need it regardless of the price.
Often, yes. The sources give some really strong examples. Life-saving drugs with no substitutes, that's a stark one.
Yeah, if you need it to live, price becomes less of an issue, unfortunately.
It does. That highlights necessity. What other examples stood out?
Table salt was mentioned. It's so cheap, right?
Well,
even if the price doubled, it's such a tiny part of your groceries, you probably wouldn't even notice or change how much you buy.
Exactly. Negligible budget share. And gasoline, at least in the short term. People still need to drive to work, run errands.
Even if pump prices go up, you kind of just have to pay it, at least for a while.
Right. Habits and immediate needs. Any others?
Cigarettes for smokers came up. Addiction plays a huge role there, making demand very inelastic despite price increases.
A tough reality. So the factors for inelastic demand, according to the sources, it's a necessity. There aren't good substitutes. It's a tiny part of the budget. It might be addictive.
Or you just don't have time to react or find alternatives immediately.
Correct. And then there's this middle ground, unitary elasticity. It's more theoretical, maybe.
Yeah, the sources presented it as a balance point, where a price change leads to an exactly proportional change in demand. So like a 10% price increase causes a 10% demand decrease. Total revenue for the seller stays the same.
It helps frame the spectrum, though, between the highly sensitive elastic demand and the very insensitive inelastic demand.
So, okay, why is getting all this demand elasticity stuff actually important?
Well, for businesses, it seems critical for pricing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. How's that?
If you're selling something elastic, you got to be careful raising prices, right? You could lose a ton of customers. But if your product has inelastic demand, maybe you have more leeway to increase prices without seeing sales plummet.
That's the core of it for firms. And what about for governments? The sources mention that too.
Yeah, for things like taxes. If a government wants to raise money, they often target goods with inelastic demand.
Like cigarettes or gasoline, as mentioned.
Yeah.
Because people will likely keep buying them even with the tax added on.
Makes sense. And what about the flip side? Subsidies. How does elasticity matter there?
Good question. The sources suggest that if you subsidize something to encourage its use, you need to know how price-sensitive people are. Right, so if demand is inelastic, lowering the price with a subsidy might not actually make people consume much more of it.
Exactly. It might not be the most effective way to achieve the goal. Okay, let's pivot now. We've talked about buyers. What about the sellers? How do they respond to price changes?
This takes us to price elasticity of supply.
Right. Measuring how much the quantity supplied changes when the price changes. And just like demand, we have elastic supply.
So producers can ramp up production easily if prices rise?
Pretty much. A small price increase encourages a big jump in production. The example from the material was basic white t-shirts. Why are they elastic?
Because it's relatively easy, right? Get more cotton, use existing factories, hire a few more people maybe. You can scale up fairly quickly.
Simple inputs, standard production.
The sources also stress time as a factor here. Over a longer period, supply generally becomes more elastic. Producers can build new factories, train workers, find new resources.
Makes sense. They have more time to adjust. Now contrast that with inelastic supply.
Okay, so this is where even a big price jump doesn't lead to much more being produced.
Exactly. What were some examples from the material?
Prime agricultural land was
Yeah.
one. You just can't make more good farmland overnight or maybe ever.
Right. Finite resource.
And things like original paintings by an artist who has passed away. The supply is fixed. Price goes up, but you can't get any more paintings.
Perfect examples of fixed or very difficult to increase supply. The sources also mention things like needing rare resources, highly specialized skills, long production times.
And just having very little time to react all contribute to inelastic supply.
And understanding supply elasticity is crucial because it tells us how fast markets can actually adjust. If supply is inelastic and demand suddenly spikes.
Prices could shoot way up, right? Because sellers can't quickly produce more to meet the new demand.
Exactly. Think about housing in really popular cities. Building new homes takes time, there are regulations, land is scarce. Supply is often inelastic in the short run.
Which helps explain why prices can climb so fast when demand increases.
Precisely.
The material also briefly touched on a couple of other elasticity types. Income elasticity of demand.
Yeah, that looks at how your demand changes when your income changes. Helps classify goods as normal, inferior, or luxury.
And cross-price elasticity of demand.
That one shows how the price change of one good affects the demand for another good. Tells us if they're substitutes like Coke and Pepsi, or complements like printers and ink cartridges.
It really paints a picture of how everything's interconnected, doesn't it?
It does. Markets are complex systems.
Okay, so that covers elasticity. Now, let's shift gears to when the government decides to step into this market dynamic.
Right, government intervention. The sources really set this up as a contrast to the idea of a purely free market, which, rarely exists in reality.
So governments intervene for lots of reasons. One direct way is through price controls. Let's start with price ceilings. What are those?
A price ceiling is a legal maximum price. The government sets a lid on how high a price can go.
And the intention is usually good, right? To protect consumers from super high prices.
Typically, yes, that's the goal. The rice example in your material was useful here. What happens if the government sets that maximum price for rice below what the market would naturally set?
Well, if it's cheaper, more people want to buy it, so demand goes up. But farmers or sellers might be less willing to produce or sell it at that lower price, so supply could go down.
And when demand goes up and supply goes down, what's the result?
Shortage. Not enough rice to go around at that fixed low price.
Exactly. And shortages, as the sources detailed, can lead to some pretty nasty side effects.
Like what? Black markets popping up.
That's a big one. Also, long queues, maybe rationing systems, sellers might cut corners on quality to save costs, and even potential corruption around who gets the limited supply.
So the lesson seems to be that setting a price ceiling too low, even with good intentions, can actually backfire and make things worse for consumers in different ways.
It's a common unintended consequence. Now, what about opposite? Price floors.
Okay, so if a ceiling is a maximum, a floor must be a legal minimum price.
Correct. And the goal here is usually to support producers, or sometimes workers.
The minimum wage example in the material fits here perfectly. What's the dynamic if the government sets a minimum wage above the level the market would naturally settle at?
Well, similar disruption, just in the other direction. At a higher wage, more people might want to work those jobs.
So labor supply increases.
Right. But businesses facing higher labor costs might decide to hire fewer people.
Meaning labor demand decreases.
Exactly. And when the supply of labor exceeds the demand for labor.
You get a surplus, which in this case means unemployment.
Right. More people wanting jobs at that wage than there are jobs available.
The material also mentioned guaranteed prices for farmers is another price floor example. If those are set too high,
Farmers might produce way more than people actually want to buy at that price, leading to big surpluses.
and then the government often has to step in and buy up that excess, which costs taxpayers money.
It can become a significant burden. So again, price floors, if set unrealistically high, can lead to problems like unemployment or costly surpluses.
Okay, so direct price controls have pitfalls. What about other tools? Taxes and subsidies seem like major ones. Let's talk taxes first.
Sure. Taxes are, how governments primarily fund public services. When a tax is put on a specific good, the cigarette example again, what happens in the market?
It makes it more expensive for sellers to supply the product, right? So their costs go up.
Which shifts the supply curve.
To the left. Okay. Less supply at any given price.
Good. And the result is usually a higher price for buyers and a lower quantity sold overall.
And even though the buyer pays more, the seller doesn't keep all of that extra price because they have to pay the tax. So their net price received actually goes down.
Precisely. The government gets the tax revenue in the middle. And the sources also mention this concept of deadweight loss.
Yeah, what exactly is that again? It sounds kind of negative.
It represents a loss of economic efficiency. Think of it as transactions that would have happened without the tax, where a buyer was willing to pay more than a seller was willing to accept, but now don't happen because the tax makes the final price too high for the buyer or the net receipt too low for the seller. It's potential value that's lost.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, a key question with taxes is always, who really pays it? The tax incidence.
Yes. And your material offered a very useful golden rule for figuring this out. What was it?
It said that the burden falls more heavily on the side of the market that is more inelastic.
Exactly. The less responsive side gets stuck with more of the tax.
So if demand is inelastic like for cigarettes, but supply is relatively elastic, buyers end up paying most of the tax through higher prices.
Correct. And if it's the other way around, if demand is elastic but supply is inelastic, maybe like those paintings by a deceased artist, if they were taxed somehow.
Then the sellers would bear more of the burden, maybe by having to accept a much lower price.
That's the principle. Elasticity determines who bears the brunt. Now let's flip it again and talk subsidies.
Okay, so these are basically the opposite of taxes.
Yeah.
Government giving money to encourage something.
Right. Financial help to producers or consumers for a specific good or service. The milk subsidy example in the material works well. What happens when milk production is subsidized?
It lowers the costs for dairy farmers.
So the supply curve shifts.
To the right this time, more supply.
Good. Which generally leads to a lower price for consumers at the store and a larger quantity of milk being bought and sold.
But while the consumer pays less, the farmer actually receives more overall, right? Because they get the market price plus the subsidy payment from the government.
Exactly. Their net price goes up.
And interestingly, there's a similar golden rule for who benefits most from the subsidy, also tied to elasticity.
There is. What does that rule say?
It says the side of the market that is more inelastic captures more of the benefit from the subsidy.
Perfectly stated. So, if demand for milk is pretty inelastic, people buy about the same amount regardless of small price changes, then consumers will see most of the benefit in the form of a lower price.
But if supply were very inelastic, farmers couldn't easily increase production much. Then the farmers would capture more of the benefit through a higher net price.
That's how it works. The less flexible side gets more of the gain. However, the material didn't just praise subsidies, it pointed out some potential problems too.
Yeah, what were some of those drawbacks?
Well, they can be very expensive for the government budget. Sometimes the money doesn't actually reach the people it's intended to help. They can create market inefficiencies, encouraging overproduction perhaps.
And things like smuggling or corruption could even become issues in some cases.
Potentially, yes. Like any policy, design and oversight are really important.
Okay. Beyond prices, taxes, and subsidies, governments also use things like quotas and tariffs, especially in international trade. Let's touch on quotas.
Quotas are quantity limits. The government says only a certain amount of a good can be produced or, more commonly, imported.
Like the car import example, restricting the number of foreign cars allowed in.
Right. And what's the typical effect of limiting imports like that?
It reduces the total supply of cars available in the country.
Which tends to do what to prices?
Drive them up. Less supply usually means higher prices for domestic consumers.
Correct. And the main goal is often to shield domestic car companies from foreign competition.
But what are the downsides the sources mentioned?
Well, consumers face those higher prices and have fewer choices. You can get weird situations like black markets for the import licenses themselves. And maybe the biggest concern is that protecting domestic firms too much can reduce their incentive to innovate or become more efficient.
Less competition can lead to complacency. Okay, what about trade tariffs then? How are they different?
Tariffs are essentially taxes, but specifically on imported goods.
Okay, so not a quantity limit, but an added cost,
Exactly. It makes imported goods more expensive when they enter the country.
which makes them less competitive compared to domestically produced goods.
That's the idea. It aims to protect domestic industries, maybe raise some government revenue, or sometimes counter unfair trade practices like dumping.
But tariffs have downsides too, right? The sources listed quite a few.
They do. Higher costs for consumers is a big one, which reduces overall economic well-being. There's the risk of retaliation, other countries imposing tariffs on our exports, leading to trade wars.
Which nobody really wins.
Generally not. Plus, like quotas, tariffs can shield inefficient domestic industries and potentially encourage smuggling if the tariffs are really high.
Wow, okay. So we've covered elasticity, price controls, taxes, subsidies, quotas, tariffs. Quite the toolkit. Given all the potential downsides and complexities we've discussed, why do governments intervene so much?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Your material laid out several key justifications. A major category is correcting market failures.
Market failures. Situations where the free market doesn't produce the best outcome on its own.
Exactly. Can you recall some examples from the sources?
Public goods was one. Things like national defense or streetlights. Private companies wouldn't really provide them efficiently because it's hard to charge individuals for them.
Right, the free rider problem. What else?
Externalities.
Yeah.
Like pollution from a factory that's a negative cost imposed on others. Or vaccinations a positive benefit for the whole community, not just the person getting the shot.
Good. The market price doesn't reflect those external costs or benefits. Any others?
Imperfect or asymmetric information where one side knows much more than the other, like a used car seller knowing more than the buyer. And monopoly power, where one company dominates and can potentially exploit consumers.
All classic market failures where government intervention might improve efficiency or fairness.
The sources also mention other goals, like making income distribution fairer through things like progressive taxes or welfare programs.
Yes, promoting equity.
Achieving big economic goals, like growth or low unemployment. Supporting new or important industries.
Strategic industry policy, yeah.
And also encouraging merit goods, things the government thinks people should consume more of, like education or healthcare.
While discouraging demerit goods like cigarettes or drugs, often through taxes or regulation.
So, a whole range of reasons.
Absolutely. But, and this is the crucial point we keep coming back to, almost every intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, can have those unintended negative side effects we discussed. Finding the right balance is the constant challenge.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up then. We've gone deep into elasticity, how sensitive buyers and sellers are, especially to price changes. We looked at elastic versus inelastic demand and supply.
And we saw how understanding that is key to predicting how markets react.
Then we explored the government's role. Price ceilings, price floors, taxes, subsidies, quotas, tariffs. All tools used to shape market outcomes.
And we discussed the reasons why governments intervene market failures, equity, stability, merit goods, but also the potential downsides and complexities.
It really highlights how dynamic and interconnected markets are. There definitely aren't simple push-button solutions in economic policy.
Not at all. It's always about trade-offs.
Hopefully this deep dive gives you, our listeners, a better framework for thinking critically about the economic news and policies you see every day.
And perhaps leaves you with a final thought to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, the potential benefits and the potential pitfalls, what do you think the ideal level of government involvement in the economy actually looks like?
And how much do our own choices as consumers and workers collectively shape the very elasticity that drives so many of these market responses?
Something to ponder.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into market elasticity and government intervention.
Thanks for exploring these ideas with us.